Digging stone, cause I'm all alone. Digging holes on a corner
Ladies and gentlemen, we invite everyone to be seated once again as we'll start our next session, which is the focused discussion on this last session of the day. So we'd like to invite everyone to be seated as we'll start the next session in a few minutes. Thank you. gentlemen, I kindly ask you to be seated as we'll start our next session very shortly. I'm very sorry to interrupt your networking session here, but we'll start the focus discussion very soon. So please kindly be seated, ladies and gentlemen. So in the earlier session, we finished part 1 on the Emerging Industry Challenge, and on our last session today, it will be a continuation from the previous session. And in the next session, we will delve into the development of CCS Hub, envisioning a future where economic growth and environmental responsibility go hand in hand. Discover how the development of a CCS Hub can catalyze sustainable economic growth, attracting new sustainable industry, harnessing the power of technology and environmental stewardship. And to lead this discussion, I'm going to ask once more Mr. Joshua Ngu, who will be moderating this session, to come up to the stage. To Mr. Joshua Ngu, I hope you are around. Yes, we'll start our event very shortly, and inviting you to the stage once more, Mr. Joshua Ngu. And therefore, I hand over the stage to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're starting on the last session on CCS today. So again, we will be talking about the development of CCS hubs for promoting sustainable economic growth. If I may, can we please have the panelists on stage? So first of all, we have Mr. Kenneth Freeman, Vice President for Policy Development for the Asia Pacific at ExxonMobil. We've got Chris Stavinoha, General Manager of CCS Solutions in Chevron New Energies. We've got Steve Cox, Executive Vice President for HSES, Net Zero and CCS for Harbour Energy. And may we have Professor Doddy Abdassah, Professor at the Petroleum Engineering Department of Institute Technology, Bandung. Professor Doddy, please. All right. Thank you, everyone, for staying for the final, I think it's the final session of the day. And now we're going to be talking a bit more around CCS Hub, and more specifically around policies, business models, and more importantly, the case studies or other projects in other parts of the world. How we're going to go about doing this is that each of the panelists would be providing a presentation of about 10 minutes. And once we're through with the presentation, we can sit down, have a discussion, and then we can address Q&A questions after this. So first and foremost, can we please have Mr. Kenneth Freeman to come on stage to have a presentation on, I think it's accelerating the world's path to net zero and building a compelling new business case. So please, Mr. Kenneth Freeman.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be here today. Salamat Sayang, good afternoon. Director General of Oil and Gas, Pak Tutuka, Vice Chairman, SKK Migas, Pak Num, Executive Director, ICC Center, Ibu Bella, Your Excellencies, fellow panelists, and distinguished audience members. My name is Ken Freeman, and I look after Asia Pacific policy for ExxonMobil's low carbon solutions business. And very much look forward to speaking with you today about what we're doing in the low carbon solution space. Our experience with CCS hubs, both abroad and here in Indonesia, and policy enablers for these to succeed. I'd like to begin with what ExxonMobil is doing in low carbon solutions, and it really involves an and equation, one in which we can produce the products societies need and lead in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, both our own and others. We're helping accelerate the world's path to net zero, and we're building a compelling new business. And it's our belief that these elements go hand in hand. One won't be successful without the other. And the world needs to urgently find a path to net zero. And that's why our low carbon solutions business is intensely focused on helping accelerate the world's path to net zero by focusing on hard to decarbonize sectors and making the path economically viable and executable at a scale that makes a wider impact for industry and society. ExxonMobil Low Carbon Solutions brings decades of experience in the low carbon industry. One of our key areas of innovation is carbon capture and sequestration. CCS is one of the proven technologies that's been discussed extensively today, and we will continue to play an important role in bringing CCS technology to scale, given the breadth and depth of our experience. We understand the subsurface, we know how to build large projects, and we know how to operate them safely and efficiently. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency agree that CCS is one of the most important low-carbon technologies required to achieve society's climate goals at the lowest cost. And ExxonMobil believes CCS hubs are needed to meet society's lower emission goals. CCS hub model has been discussed today, takes CO2 from several different emitters, transporting it and storing it using common infrastructure. This approach reduces costs and risk for companies and enables large-scale decarbonization. As we continue to grow our portfolio of opportunities around the world, it's important to note that over time, the pace of unlocking the full scale of the potential market will be enabled. First, from continued increase in the actual or implicit cost of carbon, whether that's in the form of policy support, carbon taxes, voluntary or compliance-based trading schemes, and of course, true market demand. And second, continued decrease in the cost of abatement, which will be a function of technology breakthroughs, as well as achieving timely economies of scale. These factors work in concert to drive opportunity for growth. In the next few slides, I'll briefly share a few examples from the U.S. Gulf Coast CCS activity, what we're currently seeing in Indonesia, and some policy enablers that are needed to continue driving this forward. Now, along the U.S. Gulf Coast, we've started building some integrated value chains. Strategically, the Gulf Coast is a great place to start, given the concentration of emitters, the proximity to feedstocks, and access to permanent carbon storage. And those factors, plus the Inflation Reduction Act, also contribute to these early project supporting solid returns. Starting in the Houston area, we're working on the world's largest blue hydrogen facility, leveraging existing infrastructure at the ExxonMobil Baytown site. Supporting the hydrogen plant will be a large-scale CCS network, which will offer CCS services to third-party emitters in the Houston area. Moving to the Port Arthur Beaumont area, we've just entered into another landmark commercial offtake agreement with Linde to capture, transport, and permanently store up to 2.2 million metric tons of CO2 annually. It's hard not to imagine us leveraging this for future potential activity at our nearby Beaumont, Texas site, and we'll be welcoming other third-party emitters to join. In Louisiana, we're underway on execution of a previously announced Foundation CCS project with CF Industries, and we expect to announce other emitters joining this network, and this is adjacent to existing operations at our Baton Rouge facilities. We'll be looking at future integration opportunities here, just as we're doing at Baytown today. Lastly, we just announced a very exciting agreement on July 13th relative to our acquisition of Denbury. This is a North Texas-based developer of carbon capture, utilization, and storage solutions and enhanced oil recovery, valued at nearly $5 billion. With the largest owned and operated CO2 pipeline network in the United States, it is located within the largest U.S. markets for CO2 emissions, as well as 10 strategically located onshore sequestration sites. The cost-efficient transportation and storage systems will accelerate near-term CCS deployment for ExxonMobil and third-party customers. These combined assets and capabilities further accelerate ExxonMobil's low-carbon solution business, creates an even more compelling customer decarbonization proposition, and underpins our commitment to low-carbon value chains. As we look to the global opportunity set, we're seeing the most activity in the U.S. driven by the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. But let's turn to the Asia-Pacific region, where we're witnessing energy customer activity ramping up, and we're evaluating a number of opportunities across the region. I'd like to congratulate the government of Indonesia for passing the regulations to allow CCUS to improve the recovery at oil and gas working areas, as has been discussed, presidential regulation on carbon market, and we look forward to the necessary regulations to allow emissions to be injected from sources other than oil and gas to position Indonesia to become one of the leading CCS hubs in the region. In Indonesia, we're very happy to be working with and advancing our joint study with Pertamina to exploring a high-quality saline aquifer for potential CCS hub project. What makes CCS hub in Indonesia compelling? Strategically, this mirrors our earlier examples on Houston based on the following. Indonesia's proximity to an international CO2 market driven by Asia's advanced economies, which have aggressive decarbonization plans, but in some instances, the lack of world-class CO2 subsurface storage resources. Indonesia, secondly, has world-class storage quality and capacity. Third, concentration of a domestic hard-to-abate industry with decarbonization commitments. And finally, an Indonesia CCS hub could attract other industries, such as petrochemical, interested in developing net zero products. A pioneer regional CCS hub could potentially have a multiplier effect on the country's economic growth, and Indonesia is well positioned to participate in what could be potential trillion-dollar CCS industry. Also, taking a lead in the energy transition would also increase the attractiveness of foreign direct investment to support the growth of hard-to-abate industries that comply with corporate net zero targets. The approach will also unlock new investment opportunities in low-carbon industries or power generation, such as blue hydrogen and blue ammonia. As has been discussed, very importantly, policy continues to be a critical part of success for CCS. ExxonMobil focuses on practical policy solutions that recognize the increasing global demand for affordable and reliable energy and products, while enabling scalable development and deployment of lower emission technologies. The CCS opportunities ExxonMobil is evaluating have the potential to move forward with current technologies today, but stable, supportive policies and regulatory frameworks are critical to enabling deployment and infrastructure development at the pace and the scale that is needed. There are multiple avenues in which policy and government support plays a key role. These range from policy on strategic standpoint to durable incentives that can be provided through a variety of mechanisms such as grants, tax credits, or low-interest loans, and sustained long-term government support for research and development. So, four key takeaways as I sum up. 1, CCS is a safe and proven technology for permanent storage of CO2, a key technology to accelerate the world's path to net zero, and we're building a compelling new business. Second, we have tremendous advantage built on our technology, our scale, our project execution, and our value chain integration. Third, we're building a new business model with attractive, less cyclical returns and very high growth. CCS is a key enabler to decarbonize hard-to-abate industry, and Indonesia is well positioned to be a pioneer in the potential trillion-dollar CCS industry by 2050 that will attract other investment. And fourth, we're leading now with real-world projects, moving into execution, and a rich pipeline of future opportunities is evidenced by our recent Denbury acquisition. It's essential for the government of Indonesia to move policy forward that enables regulatory certainty, cross-border collaboration, and intensify CCS hydrogen ammonia technology development. With momentum starting to build, we're very much looking forward to working with many of you in this room towards a low-carbon future. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's great and look forward to the discussion to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth, for the presentation. Next, we have Mr. Chris Stavinoha, who will be kind of presenting on understanding the CCS hub concept.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and all the fellow presenters, everyone in the audience, and all our distinguished guests. Great to be here with you in Jakarta today. I'm Chris Stavinoha. I'm the Regional GM for CCUS Asia Pacific and Middle East for Chevron New Energies. I've been in the role a whole year, so I've got a ton of experience in this space, like everyone else in the CCUS realm. But prior to that, for the last 30 years, I've worked predominantly in our upstream business, delivering large offshore projects. Subsequent to that, I worked in our midstream business. I was a VP in a tariff-based model type business, MLP structured business that we had. And then most recently, before moving to Singapore and taking this role, I was working on the west coast of the United States, delivering kind of novel CCUS projects, a BECCS, or Biomass Energy Carbon Capture Sequestration Project, that's a mouthful, for a year, and then moved into this role. So a common theme I've heard today is we're all learning in this space. It's a new space, it's very fluid, dynamic, and some common themes, but it's great. And I always love coming to these because I pick up so much information and new thought, and excited to see the enthusiasm from even a year ago where we're at today. Starting today, I wanted to talk about hubs a little bit. I can speak to them because, one, we've got a natural hub in Gorgon, which we operate down in the Northwest Shelf of Australia. Additionally, we're developing a big hub on the Gulf Coast in Beaumont, Port Arthur, called Bayou Bend. And so a lot of lessons as we move into these hub constructs, and I think we can share a little bit of that today. But starting first, if you've ever heard Chevron's message, we do believe the future of energy is lower carbon, absolutely. And when we think about it, we think of affordable energy, reliable energy, or energy security, and ever cleaner energy. So 3 buckets, and I've seen a lot of text and dialogue of the energy trilemma, so I think we fall right into that. And so common themes of what I'm hearing throughout. CCUS has a critical role, and often we get questions of why CCUS, you know, does CCUS work? Should it be clean fuels? Is it CCUS or is it some other technology? Is it renewables? CCS has a role, and we don't do climate science. There are tons of credible folks that have done an immense amount of work, including the IPCC, the IEA, the DOE, number of credible bodies in the scientific realm that have done this work, and so we accept that at face value. And so when we look at it, all of that tells us collectively you can't reach your objectives without CCUS, so it will play an instrumental role in achieving our net zero aspirations up through 2050. Next slide here. On CCUS, when I think of hubs, or when we think of hubs, I think of 2 constructs as clustered emissions, or clusters, kind of on the left-hand side. And so we have a unique set of industries in an industrial area. Collectively, that could be power, could be cement, could be steel, could be petchem, oil processing, gas processing, all sorts of industries that usually live together. And so that set of emissions makes up for a nice hub. And a hub, effectively, is just shared infrastructure surrounding or embedded in those emissions. And so in the value chain, there are all types of ways you can play from the capture side to the transport side to the storage side in a hub. And so think about common language we see are clusters and hubs together. And why we like the hub construct is it offers economies of scale. And so working in the midstream space, we always looked at asset utilization and utilization ratios and percentage, how full are these, how full is the infrastructure? And essentially a hub allows participation at a greater level to a number of emitters in a given region, and we can optimize on the design of that infrastructure, and so we can drive economies of scale. It opens up markets to small emitters that can't economically or efficiently provide for their own emissions, so they can lever into a broader hub construct. So not only are you serving big international companies that may have large emissions, but you're serving really the broader industry that can bring collectively these emissions together with a common objective of lowering emissions overall. I think one of the bigger challenges to hubs is collaboration. The more people you put into the equation, or the more companies you put into that equation, the more difficult it becomes to actually execute some of these projects. Different business drivers, different needs, and so collaboration in a hub construct is critical. So probably one of the bigger challenges we run across with hubs. I took this snapshot. I wouldn't get too fixated on the numbers or the size of the emissions. This is from a BCG tool that we utilize sometimes to look at emission footprint, but this is Indonesia and a snapshot to us, and have a whole bunch of qualifiers at the bottom around the emissions and how we get to the numbers. But in general, if you lay it out, you will see some naturally occurring hubs across the region. Obviously, Jakarta being a big industrial area, a lot of emissions, a bigger hub, and then various hub constructs scattered out. We see kind of about 100 million tons per annum. That's actually what we would deem low-cost CO2 emissions that we could capture. And so it really depends on the intensity of these CO2 streams. In terms of the cost, it's inversely proportional. So the more concentrated a stream is, efficiently and effectively, the more economic it is to capture. If it's dilute stream, leading all the way to something like DAC, that's 400 parts per million, that's a very expensive stream to capture. So that matters on that side. So when we say low-cost emissions, we're in the range of $100 per ton or less to capture. So if you look by industry over to the left, you can see almost in every case you will see power gen as one of the big emitters. What's not included in here is coal. We left it out of here. This number would be bigger. We figure those will phase out over time. There's a process for doing that. But in terms of intensity, you can see hydrogen, aluminum, you can see cement. All of those fall into the hard-to-abate sectors that I think are an opportunity for Indonesia. Not shown on here is we've also done regional screening for subsurface potential, and I think when you look at Indonesia and collective work other folks have done, we see something in the order of 10 to 15 gigatons of capacity, immense capacity between depleted reservoirs and saline aquifers. So if you were to believe this equation on the amount of emissions, it would appear that your storage long, looking at your potential for storage. So something I saw in the white paper that I found very encouraging is this thought around a business model that might involve moving international volumes in and creating a business model that was more advantageous for deploying hub solutions in the region. So I thought that was a great piece of work. This is capturable emissions, and again, a bunch of qualifiers on numbers, but the intent here is showing Indonesia at roughly 200 million tons per annum. But when you start looking at South Korea, Japan, markets that are constrained and don't have the geology to store CO2 at the same magnitude are going to be dependent on solutions in this region. So again, a lot of Australia, good storage, Indonesia, blessed with great potential, what appears to be great potential, but access to very large markets and becoming almost a hub or a provider in the region. And so what do we do and how do we move things forward, and what do you get as an advantage of a first mover? Maybe there is advantage to being a second mover sometimes, but first mover, you can help frame and develop some of the policy, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in the Q&A, but underpinning all of this is policy to action, and how do we, as we try to drive investment and capitalize in these markets, we need secure, stable policy to execute and move those investments ahead. So being a leader in that space and working with the government and policymakers is great. The sooner we start, the sooner we get there. That sounds blatantly obvious. But, you know, when I look at things in the U.S. markets and the work I've done there, it's accelerating at pace now. When I look even at Indonesia over the last 12 months, it's very encouraging. It seems as though things are framing up and starting to accelerate. So again, moving in the hub view, hubs offer a much larger storage potential. Lots of projects we've seen in the 500,000 to 1 million ton per annum. When you start getting into hubs, you start talking in the 3 to 5 to potentially even 10 million tons per annum. So that's the kind of scale we need if we're going to meet our objectives. And then, of course, the Indonesian government has indicated in their 2060 plans and aspirations, CCUS has a huge role to play. And, you know, being a first mover in this space could help commercialize and shore up some of these volumes that underpin driving these businesses ahead. So I think there is something to be said about being a first mover in the space. But thank you for your time, and I really appreciate the constructive dialogue so far.
Thanks, Chris, for the presentation. So next we have Mr. Steve Cox, who will be sharing kind of his experience with the Viking CCS project. Please, Mr. Steve Cox.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to our fellow panelists, distinguished guests, and all the delegates that have joined us here today to talk about CCS and how we can move it forward. So what I'm going to talk about today is a couple of case studies, which are, there you go, apologies. But first, what I wanted to discuss a little bit first, before I go into the case studies of what we've been involved in the UK with Harbour Energy, is really to hark back to the plenary session we had earlier and to the comments that we've had from our first two speakers, Ken and Chris, really around making CCS a commercial success. Really revolves around three key issues that you have to address before you can really move the projects forward. The first one, I mean, we've discussed a lot today about government regulation and the basis for the CO2 price. And you've seen that a number of different governments and countries have taken different approaches. If we take the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, it's all about tax credits for storing CO2. If you look at the European model with the carbon tax, there's many ways with which we can actually look at how we drive forward commerciality within a CO2 capturing. And what we have to do with all of that government policy and with the supply of significant storage capability is have the demand. So we have to get to a place where the actual industry, the emitter, feels it's more advantageous for them to actually capture the carbon and store it than it is to pay the tax to emit the carbon in the first place. So that's a key issue that we have to look through, and I'll go into it in a little bit more detail in my case study on Viking, and talk a little bit about a second project that we've also got in the UK, which is called Acorn. The second issue is obviously what Chris was talking about in terms of the hubs. How do you get that economies of scale? How do you manage that cross-chain risk management, the actual connectivity between the emitters and the transport and storage networks that you will have together to make that project at scale, to get those volumes through? And I noticed Chris said that 3 to 5 million tons per annum. We're aiming for much more than that, more towards the 10 million tons per annum, because we think that's the sort of volume that you're going to need to get those economies of scale to make what is basically a waste disposal business commercially attractive for investment going forward. And then the third one, which is something that historically all industries, and certainly the oil and gas industry, has been very good at, is solving the technical risks that we have available to, that we're going to have to fix before we can move forward. So, the capability of the storage, the long-term viability of the storage, and how we actually inject CO2 in various phases throughout the storage life of the CCS stores that we will put in place. So all of that we have to put into context. And now I'll go into a couple of case studies to show what the UK has done going forward, what we can learn from that, obviously the missteps and the right steps that they've taken, and then focus really on what Viking is doing right at this moment in terms of trying to solve that trilemma going forward. So what is Viking? So Viking is one of the leading UK CO2 storage providers. On its own, it can deliver 30% reduction to the UK's 2030 storage target, so around about 10 million tonnes per annum by 2030. We've actually independently verified the storage capacity of the Viking fields with an independent verifier, and it's around about 300 million tonnes of capacity. We have BP as our joint venture. They bring an awful lot of additional expertise, one of which is to look to be a first mover in CO2 shipping. So we are building a unique jetty at the port of Immingham to be able to bring in, firstly, stranded emissions from the wider UK, because not all emissions are created near hubs, unfortunately. We wish they all were, but they're not. Some industries, the hard-to-abate industries, are not necessarily near stores. So we're going to have to bring the stores to them, and the only way we can do that really is to look at shipping. Obviously, we're working with a number of mature CO2 capture projects in the Harbour area. They are mainly power generation and petrochemical. There are also biofuels, and various other industries will join once they see the viability. I think there's one thing that, and I'm sure we'll come on to it in our Q&A, the one thing that we get a lot of noise about in the UK is whether this is greenwashing, whether CCS is greenwashing to allow us to continue to produce oil and gas. And to a certain extent it is, because it decarbonizes our oil and gas production and therefore our energy production. But if you look longer term, there are many industries, many manufacturing industries that require carbon capture to be able to have that license to continue operating, whether that's in Indonesia or whether that's in Europe. The expectation is that those industries, as part of an overall net zero requirement for the entire world to reduce the temperature gradient, we will need to find a way to reduce our carbon emissions. And one of the most effective ways with hard-to-abate industries is to use the CCS capability. So we've got an excellent storage location for both the UK and EU. So some of the shipping will be to bring in EU CO2. And that really has an analogy to what was talked about earlier in terms of Indonesia and having the capacity and the capability to bring in CO2 from other countries that don't have those world-class stores that Indonesia is blessed with, same as the UK and Norway are. So for lots of countries, their only way of reducing their carbon emissions will be to ship CO2 to a third-party country to be able to store it geologically effectively. And obviously, one of the reasons that we've picked the Viking project is it repurposes existing infrastructure and therefore reduces the capital. And if we can reduce the capital of CCS projects, then we can make the commercial viability that much more effective. So just finally on Viking, well, what does it actually bring in terms of a CCS industry? How does it actually help the local economy? So as you can see there, it's with infrastructure investment, it's up to 7 billion full chain investment over the 10-year period. It brings new jobs into the area. It brings jobs that have a longevity beyond the oil and gas industry that we have. Certainly in the UK, it's more in the twilight years than it is in Indonesia, but certainly it brings that capability to repurpose those jobs into a long-term industry in capturing carbon. It also captures over 50% of Humber's emissions and it transports those to that geological store and brings in new regional skills, supply chain opportunities right across the supply chain from the traditional oil and gas supply chain, line pipe, steel pipelines, to the new types of careers that could happen in these low carbon industries that will come on the back of this CCS hub. And then finally, as I realized I'm running out of time, just a brief talk about, so we've got the same type of project in Scotland, trying to do the same type of thing, and the Acorn CCS, the cluster, again, the hub concept, very much in use, looking to capture the emissions in Scotland and beyond. Again, it has a shipping capability as well, so it can draw in those stranded emissions from right across the UK and the rest of continental Europe. But looking very much to not just to capture carbon in Scotland, but also maintain Scottish industry, which again will be a thought that we will need to take through into Indonesia. How do you maintain some of the legacy industries as we move towards a low carbon future? How do you make those hard to abate industries still competitive on a global footprint going forward? And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Next, we will have Professor Doddy from ITB. He'll be sharing his thoughts on encouraging energy investment in Indonesia through transboundary CO2 hub development.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and fellow panelists. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I was invited by IPA at the time the question is, can we encourage, can we support the hub, CCS hub development in Indonesia? And of course, from academia standpoints, of course, we can support that. That is the thing that we will discuss with you. But of course, that this is from the academia standpoints, okay? So the outline of my presentation today will be, because we are from academia, we like to see simpler thing about CCS and CCUS, why we need that right now, okay? So I will like to start with the background, CCS and CCUS, and then CO2 utilization, and its impact on environment, and the analog to CCS injection into subsurface. And number 4, I will skip, that has already discussed by a previous presenter. And then, what is the potential CO2 transboundary hub in Indonesia? And are we ready for that? And the last one, we like to introduce about our center, which is Center of Excellence CCS and CCUS of ITB. Okay. This is the simple definition of CCS and CCUS. Okay, the carbon capture, utilization, and storage, we call it CCUS, basically is prevent carbon dioxide, CO2, from being released into the atmosphere. Okay. The technology involve capturing CO2 produced by industrial plants and then recycling back the CO2 for utilization, or we call it CCU, or compressing it for transportation and then injecting it deep into a rock formation at a carefully selected safe site where it is permanently stored. That we call it CCS, okay? If we are looking at that figure here, okay, basically CCS is sequestration of CO2. That's basically its disposal that we are doing so far, okay? Oil industry always dispose something, formation water or other things, okay? Basically it's disposal, okay? So the CO2 storage here, disposal, is storage in geological storage, including depleted oil and gas reservoir, also in saline aquifer. When we are talking about the CCUS, CCUS basically is enhanced oil recovery by CO2 injection. That is the CCUS, okay? So this is common practice in our industry. We are doing for, you know, more than probably 6 or 7 decades to do that, okay? So there is no problem, for example. But right now, people introducing the disposal and that enhanced recovery because generic name of CCS and CCUS. That's what's our understanding, okay? Now the CO2 cycle, okay, it's happened in our Earth basically, okay? That's, we call it carbon cycle. So here, okay, I forgot to, next slide here. So basically the carbon cycle, it is a biogeochemical cycle where different forms of carbon components are cycled through the Earth's various systems like the atmosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere. Okay? So come back to CCS and CCUS. That is the form of underground storage. Okay? The underground storage of CO2 can be analog to artificially accelerating carbon cycle. Hence, it is a natural process, but we accelerating, okay? Because as we know that the excessive carbon from our industry has raised the temperature of the Earth 1.1 degrees centigrade that causes global warming. So we have to accelerate it, okay? Accelerate back the cycle underground, which is a natural process, okay? It's no harm for environment, okay? I guarantee that there is no harm for environment. And also we have to I have to remind, okay, that CO2 is not a waste. CO2 is not harmful. CO2 is not hazardous, okay? Just like any other material that you disposed before. Even CO2 is, we need CO2 for our living, okay? The doctor said that why we breathe, okay? Why we are breathing? Because CO2 content in our blood is enough that we have to replace by oxygen, okay? So it's very, very, you know, it's not harm. CO2 is not harm, okay? But we dispose it too much into the atmosphere. I think I ran out the time, okay? So what is the analog subsurface waste injection to the industry, okay? In Indonesia, okay, oil and gas companies have experience related to waste material injection. In this case, for example, drill cutting injection in BP Tangguh, slurry fracture injection in Rokan, for example, in Duri field, which requires technologically intensive methods. Therefore, the learning curve for CO2 injection will not be steep, basically. Okay? So I will skip this Northern Light projects because it's already discussed. This is a good example of a CCS hub. But let us see right now the potential of transboundary CO2 hub in Indonesia. Okay? Indonesia has a significant potential to become one of the major players in transboundary CO2 hub, armed with proper regulation and standards, ensuring CO2 is safely transported and injected in the depleted reservoir CCS, or producing reservoir as a CCS, EGR, or EOR. Okay? And also this is the readiness of oil and gas industry for CCS and CCUS. Okay? In the left-hand side, okay, let me try to start with the right-hand side. This is a PRMS, okay? How to manage the resource, oil and gas resource management system. We have the system, we call it Petroleum Resource Management System. When we are going to the CCS and CCUS, just like mirroring image, okay? Here, for example, the production become storage and reserve become the capacity. Okay? So just mirroring image of that. We are ready with this. Okay? So the CO2 storage resource management system is being developed to create consistent set of definition and classification system for internationally usage, and the basic of the SRMS classification is the accessible pore volume in the geological formation which CO2 could be stored. And this document is intended for use in geological formation completely saturated with brine, in this case saline formation or saline aquifer, and the depleted hydrocarbon field without hydrocarbon production. Okay. So finally, we like to introduce our Center of Excellence of CCS and CCUS Indonesia. This is some of the portfolio of our center. We are honored that we are given by the government and by oil and gas company to make several studies or feasibility study, including the CCS EGR feasibility study at Tangguh Field. Okay, thank you very much to BP that given that project to us. Also the Abadi and Sakakemang CCS feasibility study. We have also Indonesia CO2 sourcing mapping and spatial database, and many projects that we have developed to help the government and oil and gas in Indonesia, nationally and internationally. Okay, that's probably the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Doddy. Please take a seat and we can start with our discussion, I guess, once. So I think kind of all panelists have kind of shared to a similar kind of light in terms of the fact that it seems as though CCS hubs kind of are the way to go when it comes to developing CCS solutions, not only for upstream, but also for the industry as well. A fundamental question is, what's the attractiveness of CCS hubs as compared to, typically CCS or standalone CCS projects, right? Is it just the cost? Because we talked about economies of scale. So I'm not sure who's that. Chris, maybe with you.
All right. Yeah, no, I think cost is obviously a big driver in that equation. If we can lever infrastructure across multiple parties, that your unit rate cost is going to drop effectively. So cost is a big limiter, I think, to advancing some of these projects. So I think we're all sensitive to cost, that capital we're deploying. Another point I think is critical is it's not so centric. It's quite easy, not even quite easy, but when you're dealing singularly and you're dealing with all pieces of the value chain as a company, you have a lot more control on how to develop at least the timelines that are within your control. And so I think it's easier, but it doesn't address really holistically the sum of emissions in a given hub area. So undoubtedly, large integrated operators can solve for emissions, but it's really lifting a rising tide, lifting it all boats and solving for a broader issue within a given area. So I think that's one of the key components I see. Also, there's an element of de-risking cross-value chain, I think was a very valid question. You have a lot of players, and whether you're de-risking your investment, de-risking the operational side of, say, storage, so you can find folks that are really at depth and knowledgeable on the storage side, so you can lever that, as opposed to newcomers to that market. So I think there is this whole element of risk that you can work through.
Anything else to add, Steve or Kenneth? I think it's coming through now. Yeah.
Coming through now?
Yeah.
What I would add, yes, it would help in terms of the capital investment, because you've got that economies of scale. I think what you also see with hubs is that you can de-risk some of your operational cost as well, because you've got that volume at scale that you don't necessarily have if it's a standalone CCS project. And the other really important piece is redundancy in the system. If you've got more than one store and more than one emitter, then you've got the ability that if there's something, it goes down on a single emitter, the store is still getting volumes. If a store goes down, the emitter can still continue to operate. And I think that's the real key issue that we have to address, that we've got to have that redundancy in the system. Otherwise, you don't want outages on a power gen just because they can't store their carbon at a particular time.
But Doddy, anything to add from your end in terms of CCS hubs and why it's so important?
Yes, because I forgot to mention that Indonesia has a great potential for, saline aquifer, okay? But according to many reports, the numbers are different to each other, okay? So Malaysia is greater than Indonesia. And then also, Brunei, for example. So the government right now try to, to scrutinize this. What is the close enough? How much is the storage capacity for the, saline aquifer in Indonesia? But I like to highlight the Professor Tutuka said before that. I think the best hub for CCS right now in Indonesia, because we have the regulation, okay, is a depleted gas reservoir. Just like, for example, here in Indonesia, Arun Fields. Arun Field is belonged to ExxonMobil before, okay, to Mobil Oil. The reserve is probably more than 17 trillion cubic feet. Okay, right now, if you calculate that, because it's already depleted, when you calculate that, probably close to that number, okay? So that is the good hub. And the regulation also is supporting that. But when we are going to saline aquifer, just like you heard from the discussion, that's probably, the government still think about the saline aquifer, okay? The government regulation, the presidential regulation will touch about that, starting from, I think, from how to explore it, starting from exploration, okay, will be regulated, okay. So the near future hub in Indonesia, okay, even the transboundary or whatsoever is in the depleted gas reservoir. Okay. And we helped BP to do the feasibility study, okay, for Tangguh. So they will inject the CO2, okay, after the gas is already near depletion, basically, okay? After some probably 60 to 70% of recovery factors, they start injection. And as mentioned by Ibu Wu before that, the recovery is increasing, okay? About, I think 400 billion standard cubic feet. And after that, okay, after, you know, doing that CCUS basically as a EGR, and that Tangguh reservoir can be continued as a CCS hub. So that's why the Pak Tutuko Aryaji said it should be gradually, okay, it should be gradually. That probably the near methods of CCS hub will be developed in Indonesia. But of course that the saline aquifer is quite important because we have some, it's a great, great storage here in Indonesia. Okay. I agree with that. I support, fully support for saline aquifer hub. Okay. Also the transboundary. The problem is regulation, right? Regulation. To make regulation in Indonesia is, is quite difficult. Takes long time. Okay. That's probably my opinion.
Yep. And Kenneth, please.
I think my fellow panelists have really covered the topic well, but perhaps just to emphasize, again, the synergies associated with lowering cost, bringing in multiple entities to share the partnership and the execution, and very importantly, it's the overall impact to decarbonization. When you are addressing, a number of high emitter industries in one prospective location, there's really no more powerful way to decarbonize than a CCS hub. So I think all those things taken together really are the foundations for why the hub is the way to go.
Yeah, and I think also from a commercial perspective, right, you're having multiple emitters, and if one kind of falls over, the entire project is still hopefully financially intact. But I guess the other question is, there's a discussion, I guess, in terms of what size is required, right? So 5 million tons a year, 10 million tons a year. And I think fundamentally, the question is, as we go bigger, is it automatically cheaper? So the marginal million ton after that base 10 million tons, is that a lot cheaper, and will it continue to fall as long as, of course, the storage capacity is large enough? Is that how we should be thinking about it? Chris or Steve?
So yeah, and great comments on the storage and how you might start through depleted reservoirs and then build into saline aquifers. I think back to your question on scale, you can't scale infinitely. I think some of the challenges we see is once you start scaling up, and we scale up technologies, we're working through scaling up capture technologies right now. But as you scale, that's not just as easy as building something bigger. There are all kind of technical challenges that come with that. So I would say to an extent, as you can scale, there are economies of scale, but they come with other technical challenges, operational challenges. If you think of that whole value chain on ship sizing, pipeline sizing, compression, you just start going through the whole equation of CCUS, and you'll soon start running into some hurdles that you need to solve. So ideally, you would say, yes, let's just build it as big as you can. Yep. I think a more practical way to probably build it is in phases. And so I like kind of the construct of, do you start in a depleted reservoir? It's got its own challenges. You know a lot more about the data in that reservoir. And that's something we look at very closely early on, is the characteristics of the reservoir. So saline aquifers, we don't know a lot about them. So we have to go out and drill stratigraphic or characterization wells, figure out what we've got. Depleted reservoirs, we've been operating them a long time, so we really understand the geology, and we understand all the porosity, permeability, all the characteristics of that reservoir, which make things easier. But then we introduce other problems with existing penetrations into these reservoirs that may have to be remediated, or how do we P&A these wells? Is it acceptable for them to interact with CO2? And so you get a different series of challenges. I would say there's no preference. It seems like saline aquifers in a lot of parts of the world have much more storage capacity overall. So as you kind of unlock those, I think it broadens your overall capacity. But nevertheless, depleted reservoirs look good. But long-winded question, but I don't think it's just infinite. There's a sweet spot in there, economically and operationally.
Yep. And so today we're looking at 5-10 million tons. Is that what we're looking at in terms of a large-scale hub? Steve, or?
Just to go back to that, I think it's around scaling. Yes, always economies of scale work. I think what you're looking at, certainly with a CCS hub, is phases of that hub. So you're not trying to build everything all at once. You're trying to build that scalability in. You're looking at what your emitter requirements are, and very much then looking to use the totality of the store, but over decades, rather than trying to inject it all at one time.
Yep. All right. Thank you. And maybe coming back to regulations as well, right? Is that fundamental different? I think maybe Kenneth, for you, the regulations required for, let's say, a standalone CCS project versus a hub project, for example?
I think fundamentally, the degree to which government can provide clarity and certainty on, many of the policy components like pore space ownership, the licensing aspects, how CO2 will be, the movement of CO2, having a baseline framework in place, I think is very important relative to giving industry, a path, a roadmap, relative to what are the rules, and once we know the rules and the guidelines, and it gives us a basis for then looking at the development opportunities and scenarios, whether it's a standalone project or CCS. It's very encouraging that the government of Indonesia is making real progress in this space, associated with the regulatory certainty. And, perhaps jumping ahead a little bit in terms of the policy aspects as well, I think other things that industry is looking for is what are palatable incentives that can help drive the industry activity. And it's all of the panelists in their remarks touching on this topic, can be a variety of different mechanisms, whether it's a price on carbon or a tax credit. But that is another important element, as is, of course, the cross-border issues and resolution of those. And we're seeing some good examples globally, for how governments are discussing that and how they're coming to terms with that. So we're quite optimistic. There's certainly a roadmap of policy that can enable, I think, what industry wants to do relative to development of CCS.
Yeah, I was just going to add that there's probably two sides to government regulation and policy. So you've got the emitter side. So it's about how do you incentivize emitters to actually want to capture the carbon beyond the economic certainty of continued operation. So how do you incentivize, whether that's through tax credits or through a carbon tax? And then on the transport and store side, you've got the two issues that need to be addressed. One is the long-term liability of the store, because we're trying to geologically store CO2 here, so we don't want it to leak. And the other issue is the stranded asset piece, which is if you build a CCS store and your emitters decide that actually it's cheaper for them to emit the carbon, how do you get around the issue you'd have there with all that capital investment with actually no customers at the end of the day?
And I guess when it comes to kind of like from the emitter side perspective as well, there are different policy kind of tools, right? I mean, very common, we do have a carbon tax. We've got EU ETS, or maybe from a incentive perspective, it is some sort of a tax rebate or kind of tax incentive, or even direct investment in CapEx as well. So I guess kind of based on your experience and kind of the projects that you have been involved in, kind of, what what works and what made your projects work.
Yeah, so if I think about the various fiscal policy measures you could introduce or deploy, you know, I would suggest it. You know, we like market-based type policies that are incentivizing the industry to move in a direction, and I think it creates a competitive landscape as well. So, if you're going to be competitive as an industry player, you're going to have to be efficient, and so instead of more of a mandate or large subsidy to drive progress, the market-based approach based on more competitive nature within the industry, I think is a preference. It doesn't mean it's the only way to go. There's certainly other successful systems. Look at the European trading system, you know, that sets taxes and subsidies on projects. And, you know, they all have benefits and drawbacks, I would say. But I like the market-based approach. I think it drives some efficiencies, but doesn't mean it's the only approach that you could work under. I do think you need to establish a fair price for carbon to accelerate deploying some of these solutions. So where we end up with unreasonably low carbon pricing mechanisms, it just prohibits advancing on those opportunities. So I think that being said, and the other thing I think that folks that are financing or pulling capital in these projects are looking for stability in policy. And so if you're deploying policy that's stable and good policy that's not evolving and changing and moving constantly, it provides a backdrop or a certainty for those people investing in these types of projects.
From Kenneth?
Well, I agree with Chris's observation on market-based elements that ultimately will carry, you know, the development from a long-term perspective. But the degree to which governments can help kickstart, you know, an industry, and certainly we're seeing that, you know, as a consequence of the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. I mean, that is definitely, from our company's perspective and presumably others, creating a mechanism that is really helping underwrite that initial investment to get things moving. So, you know, a government plays an important role. You know, ultimately it will be the market that, in the commercial aspects, it's the long-term proposition associated with CCS. But, you know, agree with the comments of the other panelists. You know, again, we need ultimately a price on carbon that works. You know, carbon credits are another issue at some point that need to be addressed. So, you know, there's a variety of mechanisms that, you know, governments can really employ to help things get started.
Steve?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I think the only thing that I would add is that you need to link the emitters. So a lot of what we're talking about here is incentivizing the emitters, but you need to link that to the transport and store as well. Because at the moment, I think there's a little bit of disconnect between the policy and actually what we're trying to do here, which is we're forgetting maybe the S at the end of the carbon capture. So I think as we link those together, it will help immensely.
So it's effectively when we think about incentives or policies, then we need to really target across the value chain and think of them individually to kind of incentivize all of them.
Exactly, as I said in my presentation, it's that cross-value chain risk that we need to try and mitigate as much as possible, and government can step in there.
Professor Doddy, I think anything do you have to add on kind of maybe Indonesia and carbon taxes supporting CCS?
Yes, carbon tax in Indonesia is quite low, right? Just $2 per ton. But we had a feasibility study, okay, for Gundi reservoir study at the time, okay, and we calculate from, you know, capture, transportation, injection, okay, and then the cost and the economics, okay, and you know, for that project, Japanese government spend for CapEx, capital expenditure is, I think 100 million or Pak Denny, are you here? Some amount, okay? That's makes the project is economically feasible. So the credit is very important for this time, okay? That's the example coming from our feasibility study. The CAPEX is from the Japanese government, and then the OPEX is Indonesian company. So that is important thing, I think.
That's effectively the JCA mechanism that
Yes.
Japan has, I guess, and it's been
Right.
Oh, and I guess I think one point in which I think from kind of your comments as well is that, you know, a lot of times people think about incentives in terms of an either or. It's kind of like a carbon tax or a subsidy or a tax incentive. And effectively, again, just to reiterate and to stress that it is not necessarily the case. It is really looking at it in terms of the entire value chain and looking to see how we can make sure that we have the right policies to enable each part, the emitter, the transportation and the storage, and that might be a mixture of different incentives to make it work as well. And so I guess from a IRA perspective, we've seen a significant growth in investments in, I guess, in not only in CCS, but also in hydrogen. You know, how has that changed the investment climate and kind of the positivity of investment in CCS?
Well, it definitely, in the U.S., has enabled and incentivized a significant amount of activity associated with CCS, and also, you know, not only, you know, for specific companies reducing their emissions, but the overall synergies associated with, you know, company discussions associated with, you know, how to do it from a commercial perspective. I would also like to just maybe quickly build on the professor's comment about Japan. You know, there's a number of countries in the region that have a lot of emissions, but they don't necessarily have a storage capacity, and so there's absolutely some synergies across the region. And I recall that the Japanese government has announced something in the order of $150 billion US that it's looking to invest over the coming years associated with decarbonization and CCS, hydrogen and ammonia. So it's another important part of the equation in terms of, you know, countries that have emissions but don't necessarily have storage, and countries that have emissions and storage, and how do those things come together?
And also maybe a question for Steve, I guess, from a European perspective, right? I mean, there is the trading mechanism there is direct support, and I think from a government's perspective as well, it's really decarbonization and employment, or is you know, how do we get governments to kind of fall behind this?
The CCS story in the UK is very much around meeting the UK's net zero targets, which are pretty aggressive. So, you know, they're expecting to store about 30 million tons by 2030. And in order to do that, they've obviously got to incentivize companies to actually start to invest in CCS. And obviously, if we look at it, the carbon capture piece of that CCS. I think what they're seeing is, and what we've seen a lot in the UK, is the public perception of CCS starting to change very slowly. At first it was seen as just greenwashing. Yep. The oil and gas companies were investing in it to enable them to continue to produce oil and gas. But what we're now seeing is that as other industries are entering the conversation, certainly the power generation industry, the cement and glass and steel industries are all starting to enter that conversation now. And that is helping drive a lot of government policy and government, really the government rhetoric around CCS, which is really helping to drive investment within CCS. What we're also seeing, which is mirrored in the US, is institutional investment, quite like CCS, in terms of it ticks a lot of their ESG boxes, in terms of it ticks their environmental requirements, and it also, you know, if the regulations are actually enacted, sees a reasonable rate of return for their investment as well.
And maybe just moving on from kind of rate of return, and we're talking about revenue models here, right? And for a CCS hub, a lot of times we're talking about carbon capture as a service, right? So if you're a storage injection provider or storage provider, then you kind of typically want to charge a fee for that. Is that the only way, or is that the main way we should be thinking about it? And or is there kind of other revenue models that you've seen based on your experience as well?
Yeah, I can take a shot at that one. I think, you know, certainly when we look at it, we look at all parts of that value chain. I think storage is natural. A lot of areas where we operate and where we work, storage is kind of foundational part of the value chain, and that's an area we can move on pretty quickly, assuming policies in place that would allow you to permit and take storage. So even though that may not exist in regions around Southeast Asia, we are still exploring that. But all of those parts of the value chain, we're making investments, or we're wanting to participate in those. So storage is foundational. That's something we understand as an oil and gas company, so those skills are transferable, and we operate some CCUS facilities. So it's expertise that we have. Transport side, whether that's in shipping, pipeline work, we're in both of those places in our organization, so we're advancing with technology in that space. We already operate quite a bit of CO2 pipeline in the U.S., for instance. Now, Exxon with the Denbury acquisition is doing the same. So it's, you know, that exists, and that's an area we're definitely interested in. And capture, you know, again, talking to dilute volumes and dilute CO2 streams getting expensive to capture, we're certainly looking at that space. We're making equity investments into technologies, into companies, to accelerate the expansion and scaling of some of those technologies, so we can address some of these harder to abate emissions. So all of the places we want to be in, we may participate in a different way, but yeah, we want to be able to provide solutions in that space.
And maybe one more of the more challenging questions here is that, you know, CCS, for example, value chain is often seen as a infrastructure type business, right? And so literally you're looking at some sort of a fixed, or kind of a fixed revenue and certain set of returns. Do you think that maybe the market might evolve into something slightly different in terms of, you know, I don't know, maybe like you get paid in credits and then you kind of generate revenue from that, or is it fundamentally more fixed, and we see that in the future as well?
Yeah, and I guess where my comment is, I don't really know the eventualities that will play out at the end of the day, but having worked and managed in the midstream space for quite some time in a kind of a tariff-based business, as you suggest, more of a toll road type business, is a classical midstream case. But I think the difference here is you're dealing with specialized type storage and pipelines. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is we're seeing, so as you contract volumes in, what are those terms going to look like? Are you contracting on 1-year terms, 5-year terms, 10-year terms to secure that investment? You're looking for long-term agreements. I don't know ultimately how that plays out over time. Yep. But initially, I suspect that's what folks are going to be looking for, is longer, secure, stable contracts in the space, which would look a lot different than maybe a conventional midstream business.
Anything to add from you?
I would just say I absolutely agree with that. And the only way we can see that may change is like a spot
storage.
So yeah, spot storage. So, you know, there's a boat sitting in Rotterdam that needs to store X million tons of CO2, and then it's more of a bidding war.
Yeah, and that's when the market gets matured and optionality is
there. Yeah, that's not going to be the start of the CCS journey, that's for sure.
Probably in 20 years' time, similar to where the gas market is today. I think time's up, but I think one, I guess, final question, I think probably for all of you as well. I think there was a chat, I didn't get to it. CCS today, relatively expensive, quite challenging. Why are you investing in it, or why is your company investing in it? We'll start with some of Kenneth.
Well, certainly CCS is a proven technology. It's one that from an ExxonMobil perspective, we've been managing CO2 and the storage of CO2 for decades. I would also say that, the associated cost of CCS and CCS hubs, I think, is relative to other options, which also come with a significant price tag, and in many instances more. All options are needed for decarbonization, but it's hard to find a way to do it that, proven technology, we've been doing it for decades. It is within the realm of cost to be able to conduct CCS and hubs, and the overall impact to decarbonization, there's just nothing quite like CCS in terms of also, reducing emissions and reducing CO2 at scale in a very sizable way.
Chris, anything to add from your end, or do you see?
No, well, probably echoing the same comments, but if I go back to the first comment I made, I think up there was affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner energy. I think it's an and equation, not an or equation. And so I think we can do it all, and we've been doing it all for actually over 100 years now. So from burning whale oil to burning coal, wood, you could take it up to oil, gas, LNG. We've been getting cleaner, but now there's a push to get even cleaner. And so it's an and equation for us. So keeping in mind, again, back to this point, there are 675 million people today that don't have access to modern electricity. And undoubtedly, that would make their lives much better. And so the world is growing, populations are growing, energy demand is growing, and we continue to electrify our grid, and we need power. Oil and gas has a room to play in this over many decades to come. It's almost a false dichotomy, kind of to our point earlier, saying it's an either or. It will be there. We need to clean up not only our own segments, but help the broader industry meet our common objectives. We all live in this together. We live in the same communities. We operate in these communities. And so that's our objectives, with rhetoric aside. So the need for more energy is there. The need for cleaner energy is there. The need for security is there. If we over-index on any of those, it usually creates problems in that trilemma. So that would be my point.
Thank you. And Steve has the hardest job now, because you're the third one to comment on the same question.
I agree with everything that's already been said. I think the only thing I would add is the economic benefit of it as well, the new jobs, the new careers that we'll create, and the longevity that we will also create, not just in the CCS industry, but also all the industries that will benefit from that carbon capture.
Yeah. Professor Doddy, any comments on kind of the benefits?
Yes, I like to come back to the basic, okay?
Sure.
When you dispose something, that it costs for you. When dispose the CO2, you get money. That's the fundamentals, right? CCUS, when you do the CCUS with CO2, you have two folds of benefit. One is incentive of oil, incremental oil and gas, and you also get the benefit from carbon credit. Okay, so that's why we need the CCS and CCUS. The other thing is, okay, we have a good news basically here in Indonesia, because regardless of regulation, we have about probably 18 to 20 CCS and CCS projects right now, okay, going on here in Indonesia. That's a good news, okay? And don't forget that, let me say something to you, okay? I'm coming from Petroleum Engineering Department, okay? The Department of the Geology, Department of Petroleum Engineering, people said that is the dirty energy department, okay? Because we produce the oil and gas, we burn it, and the CO2 release, we blame for it. Okay. Now, just like, the industry 1.0, the CCS and CCUS is to clean up, to become oil industry 2.0, okay? So we are responsible to mankind because we have to, clean it up. And the best thing to clean it up, the CO2 from the atmosphere for everywhere, to capture it and stay it underground. That's a natural process, okay? So I believe that the future of our oil and gas industry will be rely on CCS and CCUS. That's my comment.
Thank you, Professor Doddy. And of course, I think we've come to an end of this panel. I would like to thank all panelists for your comments, and and I enjoyed the discussion, so it's really fun. Hopefully we all learned a lot more about CCS, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Joshua Ngu, for leading the 2 sessions, and the last one is the discussion. And also all speakers, thank you very much. And we will also have mementos for everyone on the stage this afternoon. So I'd like to ask the help from Mr. Wahyu Budiarto from the IPA board to deliver the mementos for speakers and moderator for this session. Mementos will be given to Mr. Joshua Ngu as the moderator, Mr. Kenneth Freeman, Mr. Chris Stavinoha, Mr. Steve Cox, and Pak Doddy Abdassah. Hoping that we have all the key takeaways on the development of CCS Hub, knowing that CCS is one of the things that would help the NDC, Indonesia's NDC by 2060. And don't forget the photo session together. Let's have the group photo together. Yes, be ready, gentlemen, with your smile. A little bit to the left. Yeah, more to the left, all right. Oh, okay. Are you ready? Okay, 3, 2, 1. One more time. 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, and ladies and gentlemen, once again, please give a big round of applause for all the speakers and of course for all of you who have attended and be persistent in joining the sessions today. And that's a wrap for today. But tomorrow we'll be meeting again for sets of discussion and closing ceremony. And tonight, the board is inviting everyone for Energy Cultural Night, which will be held at Plaza AI's BSD at 1800. My name is Rahma Alia, signing off for the day and hoping to see you all again tomorrow morning. Have a great evening, everyone, and see you tomorrow.